How about now? Is there sound now? Is there sound now? Well, I just did a very long introduction. Okay, hopefully people are catching it now. You'll have to tell me if there's sound, Malachite. But basically, we're talking about microchimerism, what it is, how it is the presence of cells from one individual in another genetically distinct individual. Perfect. He says there's sound. Good. And the reason I wanted to talk about microchimerism and telegony is that it's this idea that came onto the scene in sort of right-wing circles a couple of years ago. And I was like, that's kind of interesting, but not very persuasive. And then it seems to have reemerged recently. And I've learned a little bit about persuasion. And so this idea, this new concept, as Sandhya Srivastava and et al. Say, the psychological implications for this for men is pretty tremendous. So, like, how do I put this? The claim that you will see in some circles online is that when men have sex with a woman and come inside the woman, leave some genetic material behind. That genetic material doesn't go away. It stays for a long time. Maybe it alters the woman genetically in the brain. It changes the woman in some way. That's the claim. Now, there's a scientific question here of whether this is true or not. There is a psychological question of, why would someone be interested in this, which I think is not necessarily fair to ask at first, but we'll get back to that. And third of all, there's a psychological question of what is the effect that this kind of belief has on people. We're talking about an idea that women's brains are changed permanently by other men. But I think the true neurological, psychological effect here, the target is actually men's brains. This idea, if it is false, is like a virus that can cause lingering distrust and anxiety in men, and feelings of insecurity and stuff, which are easy to dismiss because feminists have kind of overemphasized them, but they're still real, and there are certain things you can do. Like, I guess the best way to illustrate the concern would be, imagine a man watches too much pornography. He watches 45 minutes to an hour of porn a day. That will shift his ideas of what is normal. Now, he can read all of the data in the world that tells him the average penis length is 5 inches or whatever it is, 4.5, 5.5, whatever it is, and he can know in his conscious prefrontal cortex that he is in fact normal, he is average, he is enough for a woman in the size department. But if he has watched enough pornography, like the persistence of the visual there and the intensity of the visual stimulation in his brain will circumvent all of the logical reasoning he has that tells him he's normal or maybe even bigger than normal, and he will feel like he is inadequate. That is the effect of that, and the persuasive power of what that image is tapping into bypasses the reasoning part of the brain. And I think that is what these arguments about microchimerism and telegony risk doing. Now, if they are true, might be good to know. But my guess based on the type of claim this is, and based on my experience in what we actually know within science, about science and what's going on in science, is that they are making claims about things that they can't possibly know and asserting them as truth, and creating a kind of psychological poison for men that is really worth, maybe at first glance, the most rational approach would be to dismiss it entirely and not talk about it at all. Just ice it out. But I think there's a risk there too. of letting these things grow and fester. So it's worth taking seriously, and also because I think a lot of the people who are curious about microchimerism and telegony are sincere, are genuinely curious people. Now I think it's pushed by people who are maybe not so sincere. Maybe they're trying to capitalize on very very nerve-touching subjects, so to speak. So I was thinking, I was planning on writing something about it, but I figured why not just explore it in real time, and then that way people can ask questions about this or about anything else, and I'll try to address them as they come up. And so I pulled up a few articles. Many of these I have not read yet. This one I have gone over a little bit. This Microchimerism, a New Concept by Sandhya Srivastava et al. From 2019. And I guess we can begin with definitions. Microchimerism is the presence of cells from one individual in another genetically distinct individual. Pregnancy is the main cause of natural chimerism. Microchimerism through transplacental bidirectional cell trafficking between mother and fetus. So that's a fancy way of saying when a woman is pregnant with a child, there is cellular exchange, mostly of blood, between the mother and the fetus. And this exchange of cells, they don't just pass through momentarily. They can stay in the body and function within that body for some time. Now, as we will see down here, there's a nice illustration of a chimera, the etymological source of this phrase. We have some examples of microchimerism, and here organ transplant and blood transfusion are two particularly interesting non-natural forms of microchimerism. If you get someone's kidney, that's someone else's cellular genetic material in your body, this can. There are anecdotal reports. I don't know how much evidence there is for this, but there are anecdotal reports that people who receive, organ transplants from donors can sometimes take on a degree of the personality of the source. Now, that could just be confirmation bias. That could just be people looking for something and thinking that they're seeing evidence, so it becomes sort of confirmation of something that they were primed to see, but there's no actual change. That's possible. I don't know either way. It's an interesting thing to think about. It's apparently a phenomenon in twins. So, and here we're talking about fraternal twins, not identical twins, because identical twins already have the same genetic material. Now, what is absent? What is noticeably absent on this list is sexual transfusion of genetic material. We don't see anything like that. Now, this is from 2019. Maybe there's some more research that needs to be done. We have an illustration of both maternal and fetal microchimerism through transfusion. There, we're talking about unknown trigger, maternal microchimerism. So I figured I would just kind of scroll through these and sort of read some of the research live and share my thoughts with them, and then you guys could ask questions about this or about anything else, and we'll see what kind of conclusion we come to. I'll still probably write something about this, but I should explain what telegony is as well. Telegony is, I'll just pull up the Wikipedia page. Telegony is a theory of heredity, holding that offspring can inherit the characteristics of a previous mate of the female parent. Thus, the child of a woman might partake of traits of a previous sexual partner. And there's one particular famous depiction of a horse, and some early thinkers on the subject in the 19th and 20th century. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But let's talk about microchimerism, which I think is more interesting because it does appear to be grounded in biology. However, the initial stuff that you look at in the biological field, rather than in the right-wing part of the internet, doesn't say anything about sperm. Now, what you do see is mentions of Y chromosomes. And I think there's a quick mental leap from, oh, Y chromosomes in a woman, that must be from the sperm. No, it's not, because it can come from the fetus of a male child, and that's actually what the descriptions largely are when they're talking about autoimmune diseases and fetal and maternal microchimerism. So here we're talking about a bunch of diseases. I don't think that's particularly what we're interested in. You can kind of scroll past a lot of that. Role of microchimerism in cancer, in wound healing, methods of detection. Conclusion. Microchimerism is defined by the presence of circulating cells bidirectionally transferred from one genetically distinct individual to another. That's pretty broad. It can occur either physiologically during pregnancy or iatrogenically after blood transfusion and organ transplants. I don't know what that means, but I imagine it means not pregnancy. Migrated microchimeric cells may persist for long periods and even decades. Much controversy exists around the role of microchimeric cells in the pathogenesis of various diseases and around their role in tissue repair. Microchimerism has been investigated in different autoimmune disorders such as systemic sclerosis, systemic lupus, erythematosus. I don't freaking diseases names. It's worse than Greek, partially because many of them are Greek. Autoimmune thyroid diseases, primary biliary cirrhosis, and juvenile inflammatory myopathies. So I'll say this is a pretty good page for giving a basic overview of what we're even talking about is. And again, bear in mind, this is in 2019, and they're calling this a new concept. Now, to me, when I see that, when you get a grasp of the speed of scientific advance in history, this means no one knows anything about this yet, hardly at all. We have not had time for researchers to do like serious long-term evaluations of these things. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't know about inheritance and relationships, and we'll get to that with Telegony in a little bit. But when right-wing people make these claims on the backs of science, it just from the date alone, I feel like that is a bold and unwarranted allegation. Science supports this. No, it doesn't. Science has recently taken an interest in and gone into that. So let's see, fetal. Let's look at this one. What's going on here? Fetal. And this is from 2008. So okay. So we're calling this a new concept in 2019, but maybe people have had an interest in it for a little bit longer, but not as much. If I remember correctly, there was something that came out in like 2012 or 2014 that was circulating around. I don't know if I pulled that one up, but I'll have to check. Anyways, fetal microchimerism and maternal health during and after pregnancy. So already, I don't think this is what we're looking for, just because, I mean, this is about maternal and fetal microchimerism, and we're looking for what you might call sexual microchimerism. Actually, let's Google that. Sexual microchimerism. Oh, here we go. Male microchimerism in females, a quantitative study of twin pedigrees to investigate mechanisms. So I already like the use of twins. That's always a good sign for controlling variables in studies of genetics and so forth. And this is from 2021, so very recent. Study question. Does having a male co-twin, older brother, or sons lead to an increased probability of persistent male microchimerism in female members of twin pedigrees? Okay, so this is not sex. This is this is twin microchimerism, not sexual microchimerism. The summary answer is the presence of male co-twin did not increase risk of male microchimerism, and the prevalence of male microchimerism was not explained by having male offspring or by having an older brother. Okay, interesting. I mean, just reading that summary answer, the conclusion sounds very tentative, very non-conclusive. Like this is what our study concluded. They're not drawing broad inferences about what is true in the world. They're just saying, in this case, the presence of a male co-twin did not increase the risk of male microchimerism. That seems like this strikes me as it reads like good science. However, it's not related to our question. So let's skip over to this one. Microchimerism of male origin in a cohort of Danish girls. So let me actually read the abstract, and this is from 2015, before I jump to conclusions about what this is or is not about. Male microchimerism, the presence of a small number of male cells in women, has been attributed to prior pregnancies, which would make sense if there was a fetus. However, male microchimerism, and again, this is largely blood circulation, so it winds up in the bloodstream and in the bones, and not really much else. Not in the brain or and we'll get to telegony in a little bit. However, male microchimerism has also been reported in women with only daughters. That would be interesting. In nulliparous women and prepubertal girls, suggesting that other sources of male microchimerism must exist. The aim of the present study was to examine the presence of male microchimerism in a cohort of healthy what does this word mean? A woman who hasn't given birth to a child. Okay. So, non-moms. Danish girls aged 10 to 15 years old using DNA extracted from cells from whole body, and reports the association with potential sources of male cells. A total of 154 girls were studied, of which 21 tested positive for male microchimerism. So that's not a small number. That's a decent number. There's a tendency that girls were more likely to test positive for male if their mothers previously had received transfusion, had given birth to a son, or had had a spontaneous abortion. So that's the mother had given birth, had had a spontaneous abortion. Okay. So if the girl's mother had had a male son, then that blood from the male fetus would circulate up through the mother, and then in subsequent pregnancies, some of that blood would wind up in subsequent fetuses. That makes a lot of sense. Again, we're not seeing anything about sperm here. Furthermore, the oldest girls were more likely to test positive for male microchimerism, which would make sense because the mother would have had less time to sort of half-life cycle through transfused blood supply, either from outside donors or from male fetuses. However, less than half of microchimerism positivity was attributed to those factors. Less than half. In conclusion, data suggests that male microchimerism in young girls may originate from an older brother and either full-born or from discontinued pregnancy or from transfusion during pregnancy. We speculate that sexual intercourse may be important, but other sources of male cells likely exist in young girls. Yeah, because you wouldn't expect, you would hope that these young girls, 10 to 15, wouldn't be having like lots of sex in Denmark. But, who knows? But they list it as a possibility. Now, it's important to point out here that the what's being implied in the right wing sort of tradcon, and often Christian in a weird way, because aren't they? They're supposed to be big on like everyone is tainted by sin. Anyways, like they're talking about women as being essentially damaged goods at a biological level. And let us suppose, hypothetically, that sexual intercourse could cause some kind of microchimerism where like the sperm cells wind up in the somatic tissue or so forth. There is a piece in here that says something to that effect. I haven't read it all the way yet, but I read the abstract. And what's the actual effect on the woman from that? Are they damaged goods? Or it would be like saying, if you met a woman and she was 22 years old, and she'd only dated 2 men before and hadn't had sex with either of them, was a virgin still. But she had a horrible accident when she was 14. It was a boating accident. She got hit with a propeller, lost a lot of blood. They managed to save her limb, but she had to have a transfusion. And the transfusion happened to come from a man. It was just the blood type that supported her blood type that they had on hand. So she gets a blood transfusion from another man. Now, are the microchimerism concerns of these right-wing guys who are talking about women suffering from microchimerism when they have, sex with other people before you, would those concerns apply to the woman in this case of a blood transfusion? I don't think they would. Not in the real world. You might say something like that online to be edgy, but I don't think anyone who met a woman like that in real life would be like, oh, she had a blood transfusion from a man. That's damaged goods, unless you're like a Jehovah's Witness or something. So, the reason to care about women's body count doesn't have anything to do with this. There are good reasons to care about that. Maybe what it indicates about their childhood and their mental health and things like that. Or, there's the old Christian metaphor of like, the paper with the glue, and every time you peel the glue away, it rips a little bit of the paper. Like, I don't know if that's true emotionally, but that's very good visual persuasion. But it doesn't hinge upon bad science or misinterpreting science. And I think the thing that's annoying me so much is the abuse of science to justify things that you don't need science to justify. So, anyways, we'll see more if they have anything to say about sexual intercourse being important for this. Introduction. To gain insight into male microchimerism in young girls, we examined Y chromosome presence in a cohort of nulliparous Danish girls. This is just confirming what it said in the summary. Male microchimerism negative. Distribution of crude OR according to exposure during index pregnancy, the mother's pregnancy history, the girl's age at phlebotomy, and maternal male microchimerism. Spontaneous abortion, transfusion. I'm going to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what I'm looking at in this chart. I'm sure this is very useful to people who've studied statistics in the scientific or in a formal context. Any male microchimerism source. This is where it looks interesting. Any male microchimerism source, yes. So there's no in some number of cases. Could you get male microchimerism from a random source? Like an accidental transfusion? I don't know. Let's do a Control F search to find. Alternatively, it may reflect that girls in the current study may have had their sexual debut and their sexual intercourse. That sexual intercourse is a source of male microchimerism. In a recent report on young adolescent behavior in Denmark, 60% of girls aged 14 and 36% of girls aged 15 reported to have had sexual intercourse. So out of 150 girls aged 10 to 15, 1 in 5 would be 15, let's assume. So that's 20% of 150. And then 36% of that. That gives us 30. That would give us 10. It would give us about, let's call that 15. That would say 15 girls in that study out of 150 would have already had sex at that point. You know, that's not a small number. So, yeah, I suppose it's possible. Of these, approximately 80% stated that they had used condoms. 80%. Well, that brings it down a lot, which prevents the transfer of male cells. Thus, at most 7.2, be expected to test Y chromosome positive if sexual intercourse is source. 13.6% of test positive, indicating that even though sexual intercourse may have involved other sources, likely exist. So that's another interesting point about this, is that even if it winds up being true, it's non-unique, which makes sex less like mystically significant in the ruining of the young virgin. You know, not just blood transfusions, but perhaps even having an older brother. However, if we observed a tendency, possibly. So I think the conclusion we have to come to here, and again, this is largely, that's the other question, is would there be a difference between microchimerism of sperm and microchimerism of blood? I would imagine not. I'm curious as to what the proposed mechanism would be by which sexual intercourse would lead to microchimerism, because it's not like you have, you know, sperm vessels that circulate it through your body. You know, does just certain parts of the sperm pass through the cell membrane and into the bloodstream and just circulate there for a while? Is that the claim? I don't know. We speculate that male microchimerism is from brother, or possibly from sexual intercourse. So they're entertaining it, which is a sign of good science, but it's also the least likely. And they emphasize, however, other common sources of male microchimerism likely exist, but we don't know what they are. So this is a pretty good, I like this paper a lot, and it sort of sets the subject in a nice context here. So we'll maybe get back to microchimerism in a little bit, but it's one of those cases, and the left does this so much. The left does this so much too, but the point of this whole thing is that the right does it too, and it's not right just because it's the opposite of what the left says. It is so easy to take a fancy word from the domain of science and to draw far-reaching inferences and conclusions from it that the science itself does not necessarily support or imply. So, you know, the psychological effects of microchimerism are not studied. And it's particularly annoying when the sorts of people who cite this are in other domains so critical of science, as they should be. And I'm not telling anybody to believe this or to take it at face value. But let's get on to telegony, which we already addressed here. So let's jump to, and we learned our new word, nulliparous. Let's do the Euterosomes one. That looks interesting. This is from 2022, from Hamid Reza Nejabati, which was brought up in this Quora discussion. So he says, telegony refers to the appearance of some characteristics of the female's previously mated male in her subsequent offspring by another male. This, I think, is real serious psychological poison. You know, if you think your woman had unprotected sex with one person in the future, you're already a cuck. That's the essential claim. So, according to evidence, telegony may occur either through the infiltration of sperm into the somatic. According to the evidence, we'll have to keep that in mind. May occur either through the infiltration of sperm into the somatic tissue of the female genital tract, or the presence of fetal genes in the mother's blood. So that's our microchimerism coming back. It is highlighted that sperm penetrates into the mucosa of the uterine and possibly alters the genetic structure. Possibly, okay? Affecting the embryo and enduring from one pregnancy to the next, which may be one of the potential mechanisms of telegony. So I hope he gets into examples of telegony before we're explaining it, because we'd be explaining something that, you know, some of us might be skeptical that it even exists. So, anyways, uterine fluid, uterine gland-derived histograph supplies key nutrients for successful embryo implantation. Is important during the first trimester, especially because of its susceptibility to maternal states. The presence of EVs in uterine fluid, uterosomes, was reported in mice, sheep, and humans. What's EVs? What's EVs? Is it sperm? Hopefully that gets explained. Including a wide range of biomolecules such as proteins and non-coding RNAs. In this review, RNAs are an interesting one because they already have a different genetics makeup. In this review article, we presented a new idea to explain telegony. Based on our idea. That's not a sentence you see in science very much. After the previous male sperm entry into the female reproductive system, those sperm which do not participate in fertilization penetrate into the somatic cells of the uterus and store their epigenetic information there. What do you mean store epigenetic information? That's not what epigenetics is. As I understand it, epigenetics is the phenomenon of external contexts and settings turning on or off particular genetic expressions. It's not... whatever. Maybe that's what it's referring to. It'll store... That's such a sloppy way of putting it, though. That doesn't make any sense. The sperm of the next partner reaches a location in the female reproductive canal where it exchanges information with the uterosomes. The uterine fluid, and obtains the proteins and non-coding RNAs required for fertilization. So there's a pre-fertilization coding. This feels like, I feel like I'm being baffled with science language. This doesn't make any sense. Because the genetic makeup of a child comes from one of the X chromosomes of a mother and either the X or Y chromosome of the father. In some combination of those things. What they're saying is that sperm from a previous sexual partner will have some effect on the uterine fluid, a permanent effect, a permanent exchange of information, which changes the uterine fluid, and that the sperm, which carries the male genetic code, the zygote or whatever it is, has to interact with this uterine fluid before it interacts with the egg. And in that initial interaction, there's some exchange of information that alters the sperm, such that the child that comes out is not the product of the male and the female, despite the X and Y chromosomes being distinct, but the product of the male, of the female, the male, and the genetic remnants of some other male. And that the uterosomes are... But this is not this is not a study. This is an idea, the lost ring of Telegony, based on our idea. This is not science. This is just speculation. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with speculation. It is an interesting idea within the domain of science, but it's people who say science shows this shows no such thing. There appears to be no there's no research. It was just oh, maybe this could happen this way. Maybe. Probably not. Let's look at this. Another twist in the evolving story of heredity. Revisiting telegony and other discredited theories of inheritance through the modern lens of epigenetics will contribute to a more complete understanding of heredity, write Angela Kreen and Russell Bonduriansky. So, I'm no biologist, but my understanding of epigenetics is that no one knows what they're talking about. We'll see if maybe that's not a good example. Maybe it's less like string theory, and it's more like evolutionary psychology, in that it's almost certainly real, but it has no predictive value, and that most of it is just so stories that we're retroactively concocting in order to fill some blank spot in our equation that doesn't make sense without this thing. But the problem is we don't understand the thing. we don't know why evolutionary psychology would have picked behavior A over behavior B. We can give a sort of just so explanation for why it's likely. Maybe this is why we grew up with this preference or not. But anyways, opinion. Thanks to the father of modern genetics, Gregor Mendel, and his experience crossbreeding peas, the textbook tells us that we know how inheritance works. We get 50% of our genes from moms. But is something else at play in determining how the offspring may look? That's what we've discovered in certain flies, which may extend to others. Oh dear, fly studies. Okay, I'm gonna put my skepticism aside for a moment. Our phenotype, the way we actually end up functioning, looking, and behaving, is influenced by the environment. That's the essential premise of epigenetics. But as this change in appearance does not change our genotype, it should not change what we pass on to our children, or so we thought. Before scientists decided we had it all figured out, there were lots of different ideas about how traits are inherited. In the 19th century, the main competing theory of inheritance, commonly referred to as Lamarckian inheritance, was the idea that characteristics acquired throughout an individual's lifetime can be passed on to offspring. Lamarck. I feel like I've heard James Lindsay joke about this. Giraffe's neck, stretched to tasty leaves, passed on the stretched neck. Yeah, we know this sounds ridiculous to our modern ears because the inheritance of acquired characters was tossed into the scientific dustbin nearly a century ago. Simply deemed to be incompatible with Mendel's laws and properties of genes. Yet, curiously enough, in the 21st century, it is becoming more and more apparent that Lamarck was at least partially correct. Non-genetic inheritance. I'm going to try to guess where he's going, and if my guess is correct, then no, Lamarck was not partially correct, because epigenetics functions differently than Lamarckian evolution. Turning on and off particular gene expressions that were dormant in your code is not the same or even remotely like a giraffe stretching its neck and then... Anyways. We all know that what a mother eats during pregnancy can influence the growth, development, and health of her child. This is easy to understand, as we can see the direct link between mother and child. But did you know that what a father eats may also influence the development and health of his child? I've heard that, yeah. This is one of the early epigenetic hypotheses. Research suggests that children are more likely to develop cardiovascular disease and diabetes if their father and grandfather had plenty of food to eat during their prepubescent years. Paternal smoking and betel quid chewing have also been linked to adverse health. Sure. Maybe because those habits or those environmental cues trigger the activation of particular genes and the deactivation of other genes. That's the essential idea of epigenetics. Experiments on rats have shown that such effects may be explained by epigenetic inheritance. Epigenetic factors are molecules that adhere to the DNA and control how our cells use the genetic information. So it's not changing the DNA. It's not changing it. It's altering. It's like getting a book and then reading a different part of the book based on where you are geographically. The book is not changing, but your bookmark might. Most epigenetic variation is erased when eggs and sperm are produced. Okay, that makes sense. Allowing the fertilized egg to start life with a clean slate. But recently, scientists have discovered that some of the epigenetic variation survives the erasure and is transmitted from parent to child. Importantly, epigenetic factors can be influenced by environmental factors, including diet. Thus, via epigenetic inheritance, what you eat can influence the features of your offspring and grand-offspring, a discovery that would have knocked early 20th century geneticists off their chairs. Well, probably not if they were entertaining Lamarckian 19th century Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Early 20th century, okay. Curiouser and curiouser. Another theory of inheritance that was discarded with the advent of genetics is telegony, the belief that offspring can inherit characteristics of a previous mate of their mother, and thus come to bear a resemblance to a male who is not their father. Could non-genetic mechanisms of inheritance allow telegony to occur as well? So they're claiming the sperm would not leave a genetic trace, but would create an environment that alters the epigenetic expression. In addition to epigenetics, there are several other biological pathways through which the paternal environment could influence offspring traits. For example, it's well known that seminal fluid can carry sexually transmitted diseases and infections. Yeah, we don't care about that. It's not what we're talking about. But semen also carries a cocktail of protein, sugar, enzymes, and hormones. There is good evidence that seminal compounds transmitted by a male can alter the physiology and behavior of its mating partner. Good evidence suggests that seminal compounds transmitted by a male can alter the physiology and behavior of its mating partner. I'd like to see that evidence. I'm not doubting it. I'm just curious because that's a very vague statement. The physiology and behavior of its mating partner. In what ways? Moreover, if seminal compounds are also absorbed by eggs, then the semen could potentially influence the development of offspring. That is how that works, yes. If an egg absorbs... okay, they're talking about the seminal fluid, not the sperm. I'm sorry, I was about to make a very, very dismissive joke. Yes, if you combine an egg and a sperm cell, strange things, that can affect the genetic outcome. Then the semen could potentially influence the development of offspring, perhaps including offspring that develop from eggs ultimately fertilized by a different male. Well, how would seminal fluid be reaching eggs? How would seminal fluid be reaching eggs that were not there? So I don't know how many men in these right-wing circles have spent some time married. That sperm does not stay there. It doesn't. It goes away, and you notice it. Anyways, what do the flies tell us? Well, nothing, but we'll read it anyways. We recently carried out an experiment in which we fed male fly larvae a diet low in nutrients, or high in nutrients, and made these small and large males to immature females to expose their developed eggs to seminal fluid. 2 weeks later, we mated each female to a second, small or large male, to fertilize her mature eggs. So they've done a good job setting up a an epigenetic test environment. Genetic paternity analysis confirmed that the second male sired the offspring, but offspring size was determined by the diet of the first male that the female mated with. In other words, semen from small males resulted in small offspring. While semen from large males resulted in large offspring. The potential for such effects exists in any species where females can mate with more than one male and eggs are fertilized internally. You don't know that. No, you don't know that. You don't get to say, well, it happened in flies, therefore. Oh, but we do not know whether similar effects can occur in other species. And contrary to what you might read in some media, there is no evidence of telegony in humans. It's so annoying they linked to a Jezebel article. Jesus. There is no evidence of telegony in humans. So that's an interesting thing to say. And to point out that the people who are saying, yes, telegony does exist in humans and are pointing to articles like this, because they're speaking of heredity in general, those same scientists are saying there is no evidence. But these are exactly the sorts of scientists who, if they did find evidence, they would be more than happy to share it because it's interesting. Revisiting telegony and other discredited theories of inheritance with our modern understanding of non-genetic mechanisms of inheritance will, we hope, ultimately contribute to a more complete understanding of heredity. So, that's a pretty good explanation of the idea. The problem, as I see it with telegony, is that you've got now a couple examples of hypothetical models for how it could work if it happened. However, we haven't seen it happen. There's one account on like the Wikipedia page where they describe, a white horse that first is mated with like some non-white horse, like a darker horse, and then later it mates with another pure white horse. So white horse, and the offspring of this white horse and white horse union have brown stripes on their legs. And so the people who bred that horse were like, oh, this is evidence of like the first horse having a genetic impact on subsequent generational offspring. Anyone who knows the basics of genetics understands that that's not what's going on. What, Junie? I'll get to you in a little bit. Sorry about that. Where was I? Oh, the horses. You can look at well, myself, for example. I have blue eyes. My wife has brown eyes, and all three of our oldest three kids have green eyes. How is that possible? Well, it turns out that both my father and her father have green eyes. So like the genetic explanation of that is so obvious. It doesn't need much in the way of explanation. It's very easy to imagine two horses with, and I'm oversimplifying this. I don't need genetics nerds to come in and be like, but we're speaking in broad conceptual terms here. We can imagine two white horses where some part of the body, the white coat, is dominant, and they have some recessive trait there as well. And then when two horses with a dominant and a recessive trait, so they both express the dominant, have a child, there's some chance the offspring inherits a double of the recessive. Some of it, we know now it's a lot more complicated than that, but you get the idea. The offspring of parents that look similar are not always are not always the same. Now, this is not to say, if a white woman and a white man have offspring and one of the children is like Hispanic. That's we're not talking about that. We don't need to get silly about that. But it is interesting to hear scientists speak very seriously about telegony, and with what reads to me as a serious curiosity, and at the same time say, yeah, there's no evidence of telegony in humans. So, anyways, let's look at this real quick. Fetal genes in mother's blood, a novel mechanism for telegony. Telegony is a discredited genetic phenomenon that a previous male may influence the characteristics of offspring subsequently born by the same female to another male. Although its reality was acknowledged by Darwin and Spencer, it's been met with skepticism because of a lack of understanding of the theoretical basis for telegony. Oh, and also, I think, a lack of evidence, but we'll maybe get to that. With the discovery of fetal genes in mother's blood, so microchimerism, the penetration of somatic cells by sperm, I'm curious what their proposed mechanism is. Is it that uterine thing? Is that uterosomes thing? And the ability of RNA to program genome rearrangement. What? Oh, we're not talking about... I'm thinking of something else. RNA, yeah. A lot of people are now familiar with RNA. And this is 2013. This is not 2022. So, mechanisms might exist for telegony. So that right here is, I think, the key phrase. So both with the uterosomes one, based on our idea, and when was this? 2022. Mechanisms might exist for telegony. 2013. So this is speculative. This is not science. This is biologists saying, we wonder if. So, I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about. But people should seriously stop saying, oh, the science supports this. So, anyways, we read that one. Microchimerism. There's a Quora article. So, anyways, yeah, that's the gist of what I wanted to talk about, is because I think the people who are they're not exploring this subject, but who are pushing this as what happens when a woman has sex with a man is the man doesn't fully leave her. He gets inside her, and it's like there's a psychology of what's the right word? Is it not stain? A psychology of being dirtied, of being stained by other men. That is, being that they are appropriating the language of science to back up. That belief doesn't come from science. The belief comes usually from religious or cultural or personal beliefs. And then they find some sciencey language to justify it. But that's not what the science is saying. The science talks about microchimerism with interest. It talks about telegony with great interest with the flies. That's cool. That's interesting with the flies. But that's not, first of all, it's not applicable to humans. Second of all, it's not saying anything. There's no scientific evidence for the sorts of conclusions that they're trying to draw from the science done around these words that they are appropriating to push ideas into the minds of men that will trigger their disgust circuitry, that will trigger their disgust with and distrust in women, especially any women who have had relationships with other men before them. And to me, this seems like a recipe for men not trying anymore. And, they're going to end up alone forever. If you think that's a win because you stayed pure and you weren't a cuck because you didn't date a woman who once dated another man before. Good on you, I guess, but if genetics is your frame, you're losing out by the one metric of success. You're making yourself a loser within that frame. And it seems to me to be a lot more like sour grapes rationalization and the appropriation of science to justify that sour grapes rationalization, but worse, because they're pushing it on other men. And they're pushing it on other men in a way that makes them, that shoots straight past the prefrontal logical part of their brain and into that deeply emotionally powerful mammalian hindbrain. That disgust circuitry is really hard to overcome with logic and reason. So within the scientific frame, studying fruit flies and so forth, I think this is actually kind of cool, kind of interesting to study. But just from looking at these 4 articles and what they're actually saying, I wasn't expecting this actually, because I had pulled these up. I read the abstract of this one, and actually looked through the images and stuff. I hadn't read these 2 before I started reading this, and there's literally no study. It's not science. It's just here's an idea, based on our idea, the ability to RNA mechanisms might exist, and then this Danish study said we speculate that sexual intercourse may be important, but other sources of male cells likely exist in young girls. So it's a whole lot of we don't know, which is what good science is supposed to sound like. Good science says we don't know. We need to do more research. We need to isolate more variables, try things out, see what's going on. What these right-wing bloggers are doing is they're not leaning on the science. They're being just as bad as leftists are with climate science or freaking epidemiology. It's ridiculous. Don't let them poison your mind. I guess that's the takeaway. I got a couple people listening. That's cool. No other questions. So I think I'll call it there before my daughter comes in and bugs me about food again. So anyways, thanks for listening. Hopefully some people found this somewhat interesting. I think it's very interesting, but also very dangerous. So